Bulma had faced tyrants who could shatter planets. She had stood in the shadow of gods who erased civilizations before breakfast. She had reverse-engineered alien war machines, outsmarted emperors with power levels that broke every scale she had ever built, and survived a universe where the apocalypse arrived on a Tuesday with a smirk. She had seen impossible things, things that would shatter the sanity of any ordinary person. And she had met them all with a wrench in one hand and a scanner in the other. So when a dimensional anomaly ripped open inside her lab on Capsule Corporation's upper research floor, she did not scream. She did not panic. She grabbed her Dragon radar, her emergency toolkit, and stepped through the tear like it owed her an explanation. She landed in New York, or something that used to be New York. The skyline was familiar enough. Steel towers, gray sky, the low gray hum of a city that never stops moving. But something was wrong before she even had time to breathe. Not wrong in the way of a crumbling war zone, wrong in a cleaner, more unsettling way. The billboards were enormous. Not news billboards, not commercial advertisements for soft drinks or streaming platforms. They were monuments. 40-foot-tall portraits of smiling people in capes, rendered in the saturated colors of propaganda posters. The 7, America's greatest heroes. Vought, protecting the future. And at the center of every image, burning with a smile so practiced it had stopped being human, was a man in red, white, and blue. His eyes were the same shade of blue as a gas flame. Bulma stared at the billboard. She had seen that kind of smile before. Not on heroes, on conquerors who had learned that a smile moved crowds better than a fist. She reached into her jacket and activated her scanner, running a baseline environmental sweep. Atmospheric composition, electromagnetic signet, pure, dimensional resonance drift. Everything read normal. This was not a post-apocalyptic fragment. This was not a corrupted simulation. This was a fully functioning civilization. Clean roads, working infrastructure, functioning media, and underneath all of it, like blood soaking through white carpet, something deeply and systematically wrong. She could not identify it yet, but she had spent enough time around dangerous things to recognize the particular silence that powerful lies make. She walked. That was always step one in an unknown world. Observe before acting. She passed newsstands carrying headlines about a hero called Homelander who had apparently saved a commercial flight, a senator who was rumored to have Vought connections, and a celebrity soup marriage that had generated more coverage than the latest foreign conflict. People moved around her with the comfortable numbness of those who had been given an easy narrative and had chosen not to question it. She watched a child point at a Homelander action figure in a shop window with reverence usually reserved for religious icons. She watched a father nod approvingly. She watched a television in a cafe window cycle through footage of the same smiling man in the same clean uniform, descending from the sky like a manufactured miracle. Then she saw it. In an alley, half hidden behind a dumpster, a man in a torn jacket pressed against the wall, breathing in shallow, terrified bursts. His eyes tracked the sky, not the street, not the people around him, the sky. Like something might come from above that he could not outrun. Bulma followed his gaze upward. Nothing there, but the fear on his face was the kind that does not come from a single bad experience. That was chronic terror, the kind built one incident at a time, over years by something so powerful that running was pointless and reporting was fatal. She had seen that face on the populations of planets under Frieza's empire. She recognized it the way a doctor recognizes a disease. Not by one symptom, but by the shape of what was missing from a person's eyes. She pulled out her scanner again and began cross-referencing the electromagnetic profiles of the soups she had glimpsed on the billboards. The readings were extraordinary, not Dragon Ball scale, nothing here was touching that ceiling, but staggering by any normal human measurement. Strength, speed, heat vision, molecular resilience, all of it clean and intense on the energy readout. But here was the thing that stopped her cold and held her there on the pavement while the city noise moved around her like water around stone. None of these readings matched natural development. She knew what organically evolved power signatures looked like. She had cataloged enough of them. These signatures had something else underneath them. A synthetic baseline, a manufactured architecture. Someone had built these people. Someone had designed their power like a product line, calibrated it like a budget, and then released it into the world wearing a cape and a brand deal. She lowered the scanner. Her jaw was not set in fear. It was set in the specific, cold expression she reserved for problems that were simultaneously fascinating and unacceptable. This was not a world under threat from a tyrant. This was a world where the tyrants had been given a marketing department. The monsters were not hiding. They were on billboards. They were in children's bedrooms as action figures. They were in government briefings as strategic assets. They were on television every night, smiling the smile of something that had learned humans were ease to control when they were grateful. And somewhere in the gleaming antiseptic towers above this city, someone was running the numbers on exactly how much human suffering was acceptable per fiscal quarter. Bulma had fought monsters who wanted to rule the world. She had never encountered a world that had already handed the monsters the lease. She closed her scanner, tucked it away, and looked up at the nearest Vought tower. Glass and steel and corporate geometry. Beautiful the way a trap is beautiful before it closes. The question, she decided, was never whether she could survive a world like this. She had survived worse by breakfast on most days. The real question was something sharper and colder and far more dangerous. What would happen to a world like this when she started pulling the threads? Because threads like these, in her experience, did not unravel neatly. They unraveled everything at once. And if you're here for the kind of story that ends with clean victories and easy answers, this is the wrong universe. Subscribe now, because what happens next is going to be much darker and much more interesting than anyone in Vought's boardroom was prepared for. To understand why Bulma was uniquely dangerous in a world like this, you had to understand what she actually was, not what she looked like, not the surface-level impression of a wealthy, brilliant woman who happened to travel with gods and aliens. You had to understand the deeper architecture of her mind. Bulma Brief was the daughter of the man who invented the Capsule Corporation, a technology that compressed physical matter to pocket scale and reshaped the logistics of an entire civilization. She had grown up inside a laboratory the way other children grew up inside playgrounds. By the age of 16, she had built the Dragon Radar, a device that tracked mystical objects across a planetary surface using a detection method that should have been theoretically impossible. By the time she was an adult, she had reverse-engineered Saiyan battle armor, rebuilt time machines from scratch, and cracked alien systems that her own universe's greatest engineers had spent decades failing to understand. She did not have power in the traditional sense. She had something rarer, and in many situations, far more destructive. She understood how things worked. All things, all the time. The boy's universe, by contrast, was not built on elegant science. It was built on controlled mythology. Bulma spent her first 48 hours in this world doing what she always did in unfamiliar territory, gathering data quietly and letting the environment explain itself. She found a motel that accepted cash, paid with currency she fabricated using a micro printer she kept in her emergency kit, and set up a mobile analysis station no larger than a suitcase. She began pulling publicly available data, Vought financial disclosures, hero incident reports, casualty statistics from hero interventions, medical literature on unexplained biochemical anomalies in urban populations. The numbers were not hidden. They were just buried under enough positive press coverage that the average person never bothered to dig. But Bulma was not the average person. She was the person who built the shovel and enjoyed the digging. What she found in those 48 hours reframed everything. Hero incident response, cross-referenced against actual emergency service data, showed a catastrophic gap between the narrative and the reality. Saved lives appeared in press releases. Structural collapses, civilian casualties, and property destruction costs appeared only in municipal budget reports that no network was covering. Compound V, a substance she had only seen referenced in fragments of leaked medical literature, showed up in trace biochemical profiles scattered across pediatric health records. Going back decades, someone had been dosing children, not experimentally, systematically, quietly, at scale. Bulma sat back from her screen and experienced something she did not often feel. Not surprise, but a particular heavy, cold disgust that settled in her chest like lead ballast. This was not rogue science. This was policy. She was still sitting with that realization when the door to her motel room was kicked open. She had her scanner up before the dust settled, running threat profiles on the 4 people who entered with the practiced aggression of people who had learned that hesitation cost lives. A broad man with a shaved head and a British accent that carried more contempt per syllable than most people managed in full sentences. A younger man in a button-down shirt with the eyes of someone who had seen too much and was still trying to process it. A Frenchman with a manic, hungry-eyed curiosity that immediately clocked her equipment with something close to delight. A methodical, precise man who had already assessed the room's exits before he finished stepping through the door. Behind them, silent and watching everything, a woman whose stillness carried more weight than all the others combined. Bulma looked at them for exactly 2 seconds, lowered her scanner and said, "You're the people investigating Vought. You're terrible at surveillance, by the way. I noticed the tail 6 hours ago." The one with the British accent, Billy Butcher, she would learn, looked at her the way a man looks at something he does not yet know whether to use or to distrust. He told her, in language that was more colorful than necessary, that she had stumbled into something that got people killed. Bulma told him she was aware of that and that she was currently more useful than any other asset he had access to, which was not arrogance but a straightforward assessment of the technical GT between his operation and hers. Huey Campbell, the younger one, asked where she was from. She gave a version of the truth that omitted dimensional travel and simply said she was an independent researcher who had arrived in the country recently. Frenchie was already crouched beside her suitcase workstation, reading the display with wide, delighted eyes. Marvin Milk, MM, was watching the window. Kimiko was watching Bulma, not with suspicion, with the steady measuring gaze of someone deciding whether another person was real or performance. The boys did not trust her. That was rational, and Bulma respected rationality. Butcher in particular looked at her the way he looked at everything that was not already classified as a weapon or a liability, with the cold calculation of a man who had long ago decided that survival required sorting the world into useful and dangerous, and that the 2 categories were not mutually exclusive. He told her they could not use civilians. She told him she was not a civilian by any functional definition. She then pulled up the compound phi analysis she had run overnight, cross-referenced pediatric records, Vought subsidiary pharmaceutical filings, and traced biochemical markers from a dozen hero incident sites, and laid it across the screen in a visual architecture that was impossible to dismiss. Butcher stared at it for a long time. Then he sat down. That was how alliances began in this universe. Not with trust, but with evidence too important to ignore. Frenchie asked her, with genuine intellectual excitement, whether she could build something that would disrupt a soup's biochemical equilibrium without lethal force. She told him she could build several versions in different delivery formats and have prototypes within 72 hours depending on materials access. He laughed, a bright, slightly unhinged laugh that she found strangely comforting because it reminded her of how she felt when a problem opened up into something genuinely interesting. MM asked whether any of her tech could be traced back to their operation. She told him no, and explained the electromagnetic masking profile her equipment ran at baseline. Huey asked quietly, and with the particular earnest sincerity of someone who had not yet been fully crushed by the world, whether she thought they could actually win. And Bulma, who never made promises she had not already calculated the probability of keeping, looked at him with an expression that was not quite reassurance and not quite doubt. She told him she had not finished the math yet, but she was working on it. Because that night, after the others had left and Kimiko had remained, sitting in the corner, not as a guard but as the kind of quiet witness that some people become when they have survived things that left them more honest than language, Bulma ran a deeper sweep. She cross-referenced everything she had gathered against Vought's public architectural footprint, the towers, the research subsidiaries, the shell companies, the defense contracts, and underneath all of it, like load-bearing rot inside a beautiful building, she found references to projects with clinical code names and zero public documentation. Dark architecture, locked behind security protocols that were sophisticated by this world's standards, but not. And this was the part that kept her awake. Not sophisticated enough to stop her. There were things beneath Vought's surface that the public exposés and the hero scandals were only scratching, and whatever they were, they had been running for a very long time. The question was no longer whether Bulma could find the truth. The question was whether the truth, once fully exposed, would be something this world was even capable of surviving. Compound V, up close, was one of the ugliest things Bulma had ever seen, not aesthetically, chemically. She had worked with exotic matter, alien biology, and energy compounds that operated outside the known laws of physics, and none of them had ever offended her the way this substance did. It was not poorly made in the way of student lab mistakes or rushed prototypes. It was poorly made in the way of something that had been deliberately kept incomplete. The synthesis architecture was intentionally destabilized at the molecular level, not by accident, not by limitation of knowledge, but by design. Whoever had built Compound 5 had built it to be dependent, to require continued exposure, to create enhancement that could never be fully self-sustaining, because a soup who needed the corporation to maintain their own power was a soup who could never fully bite the hand that made them. Bulma stared at the molecular model rotating on her screen for a long time. Then she wrote one word in her notes: leash. The sample had come through Frenchie, who had acquired it through methods he described only as efficient and inadvisable, which Bulma had learned to interpret as both accurate and sufficient. She ran 17 separate analyses across 2 days, cross-referencing the compound's behavioral profile against biochemical literature, Vought's own leaked internal memos, and the physiological data she had pulled from hero incident medical reports. The picture that assembled itself was grimmer than she had anticipated. Compound Phi did not simply grant power. It rewrote developmental architecture from the cellular level upward, and it did so in ways that created profound psychological side effects the Vought documentation cheerfully categorized as behavioral variance within acceptable parameters: aggression dysregulation, empathy erosion, grandiosity patterns consistent with induce, narcissistic architecture. Bulma translated that clinical language into plain terms. They were building people who were physically godlike and emotionally broken, and they had decided that was acceptable. They had decided that on a spreadsheet. She shared the full analysis with the boys in a meeting that began with Butcher's characteristic impatience and ended in a silence that was heavier than any argument. Sat with his hands flat on the table, processing. Huey looked like someone had reached into his chest and rearranged something fundamental. Frenchie read through the empathy erosion data twice, and the manic light behind his eyes dimmed slightly into something more careful and sad. Butcher, predictably, extracted the single most immediately weaponizable conclusion from the entire report and asked whether Bulma could synthesize an inhibitor, something that would interrupt the compound's active cycle in a living subject and suppress their enhancement temporarily. Bulma told him yes, technically, but that the side effects on the subject would be severe and unpredictable. Butcher said that sounded fine. Bulma told him it was not her definition of fine, and that she needed him to understand the difference between a scientific tool and a weapon, because that difference was going to matter later. He looked at her the way people look at principles they find inconvenient but cannot entirely dismiss. She began building anyway, because the alternative was leaving the boys with nothing, and nothing was not a strategy she could accept. Her workspace had migrated from the motel to a location had sourced, a decommissioned light industrial unit on the edge of a borough that Vought's surveillance architecture apparently considered too unglamorous to monitor heavily. She filled it with equipment sourced from 17 different suppliers using shell identities that were untraceable by any investigative methodology this world currently possessed. Within a week, the space looked like the intersection of a physics laboratory and a tactical planning center. Scanners mapped local soup movement patterns. Servers processed intercepts from Vought communication channels that she had quietly penetrated using a passive signal threading technique she had developed for monitoring Frieza's fleet movements and adapted across 3 evenings of focused modification. The boys walked through the space on the 4th day and stood in collective, slightly stunned silence. Even Butcher, who expressed admiration roughly as often as he expressed uncertainty, said nothing for a full minute. Then he said it would do. The first real result came on day 9. She had been running a predictive model on hero incident patterns, cross-referencing response times, location data, media coverage triggers, and emergency dispatch records, when the model surfaced an anomaly that was too consistent to be coincidental. Certain incidents, categorized in public records as spontaneous emergencies requiring heroic intervention, showed a pattern of pre-positioning. Vought assets were present before the incidents were reported. In 11 separate cases over 18 months, the hero response preceded the emergency call by margins that were physically impossible without foreknowledge. They were not just responding to disasters, they were staging them. Controlled emergencies, manufactured in just enough chaos to look authentic, calibrated precisely to generate the kind of footage that drove merchandise sales, approval ratings, and government contract renewals. Bulma documented everything with the methodical precision of someone who understood that evidence, to be useful, had to be not just true, but irrefutable. She presented this to the boys on day 10, and the reaction split along the lines she had already predicted. Huey wanted to go public immediately. MM wanted to verify independently before any action. Frenchie wanted to know whether the staging infrastructure could be reverse-engineered to expose future incidents in real time. Butcher wanted to know what else she had. What she had, she told them, was the beginning of a map, and maps only become useful when you have identified every road. She was not finished. She was not close to finished. But she had found enough to confirm what she had suspected from the first night. Vought was not simply a corrupt corporation operating inside a broken system. Vought was the system. The heroism was not a product the corporation sold alongside its real business. The heroism was the product. Every cape, every rescue, every smile from a 40-foot billboard was load-bearing architecture inside a machine built to manufacture consent on an industrial scale. Then Vought noticed her, not through surveillance, not through informants, through the thing that powerful systems always detect first: disruption of pattern. Predictive models that Vaught's internal analytics team ran on threat assessment had started returning anomalies. Secure communication intercepts suggested a penetration they could not source. Hero incident coverage was being challenged online with documentation precise enough to survive fact-checking. Documentation that did not read like activist leaks or investigative journalism, but like engineering analysis. Someone was not just opposing Vought. Someone was studying it with the clinical attention of a scientist preparing to disassemble a machine. A quiet alert moved through Vaught's security architecture, escalating through 3 layers of internal clearance before reaching a desk where decisions about quiet eliminations were made without ceremony or paperwork. The order that came back down the chain was simple. Find the source. Not publicly, not loudly. Find it, contain it, and close it before it became a story. They had no idea yet who they were looking for. That advantage would not last long. And somewhere above all of this, in a penthouse that occupied the top floor of Vought Tower like a throne room that had never needed a king because the king was always performing somewhere else, Homelander stood at the glass and looked out at the city that loved him. He was reading a briefing document, and there was a line in it that had drawn a small, tight furrow between his brows. The expression he wore when something had entered his world that did not fit the categories he used to organize it. The line read, "Unknown actor, non-soup, suspected theoretical physics background, demonstrating intelligence profile inconsistent with any known domestic or foreign operation." He read it twice. Then he folded the document with the calm of a man who had learned to perform calm when what he felt was something considerably less stable. He was not afraid, he was curious, and in this universe, Homelander's curiosity was one of the most dangerous things alive. There is a specific kind of horror that has nothing to do with monsters or violence or death. It is the horror of scale. The moment when you stop seeing individual crimes and start seeing the architecture beneath them, the deliberate, load-bearing structure of a system designed from its foundation to produce exactly the suffering it is producing, not as a side effect, not as a failure, but as the intended output of every decision ever made inside it. Bulma had felt that horror's roar once before, when she had fully understood the scope of Frieza's empire, not just the planets destroyed, but the bureaucratic infrastructure of destruction, the supply chains of genocide, the administrative normalcy surrounding annihilation. She had felt it then like cold water rising around her ankles. She felt it again now, mapping Vaught's hidden infrastructure across 17 screens in a room that smelled of solder and recycled air, except this time the water was rising faster, because Frieza's empire had been built on naked, unapologetic power. Vought had built the same thing and taught everyone around it to applaud. The map she was building was not metaphorical. It was literal, a layered network diagram that had started as a simple corporate structure chart and had metastasized across 3 full display screens into something that looked less like a business and more like a nervous system. At the surface level, Vought International, its subsidiaries, its media holdings, its pharmaceutical arms, its defense contracting divisions. One level down, the research programs, not the public ones with clean names and optimistic branding, the ones with clinical alphanumeric designations and zero public documentation buried inside subsidiary ledgers that would take a forensic accountant a decade to untangle without her tools. 2 levels down, the black sites. She had identified 7 probable locations based on power consumption anomalies, supply chain irregularities, and the particular kind of electromagnetic shielding signature that only appears when you are running experiments you need the rest of the world to never know about. And at the deepest level she had reached so far, something she had only glimpsed in fragments, a project designation that appeared in 3 separate internal communications and then vanished, scrubbed with the thoroughness of people who understood that digital deletion was only convincing if you did it before anyone was looking. The designation was Godmaker. She had written it at the center of the map in red and circled it 3 times. She brought Frenchie in first because Frenchie was the one whose mind operated closest to hers in terms of lateral reach and comfort with the genuinely strange. She walked him through the black site analysis and watched his face move through several expressions before settling on the grim, focused look of a man who had seen enough darkness to recognize its shapes. He told her about things the boys had encountered at the edges of Vaught's experimental programs, things that had not made it into any official documentation because the subjects of those experiments were either dead, missing, or had been reclassified as something other than people. Bulma listened and cross-referenced everything he said against her map in real time, watching the network diagram shift and expand as new data points found their places in the structure. By the end of the conversation, the map had grown another layer, and Godmaker had 3 new connections drawn to it in red. She began developing countermeasures in parallel because Bulma was constitutionally incapable of identifying a problem without simultaneously engineering responses to it, and because she understood that information without capability was just grief. The first device was a soup threat alert system, a portable scanner network that could detect the biochemical and electromagnetic signature of an enhanced individual within a 300-meter radius and profile their specific enhancement type based on compound V variant markers. She built 4 units in 2 days. Took them apart, examined the components with the practiced skepticism of a man who trusted nothing mechanical until he understood every piece of it, and then reassembled them with the quiet approval of someone who recognized quality engineering. The second device was more complicated, a localized biochemical inhibitor field, an emitter that could temporarily disrupt the active cycle of compound Vi in a subject within close range, reducing their enhancement significantly for a window of approximately 4 to 7 minutes, depending on their baseline dosage history. She was clear with the boys about the limitations. 4 to 7 minutes was not a victory. It was a margin. The difference between those 2 things was the difference between strategy and wishful thinking. Butcher wanted more. He always wanted more, which Bulma had identified early as both his greatest tactical asset and his most consistent liability. He pushed for a version of the inhibitor that could be delivered remotely, at range, without requiring proximity to the target. She told him she could build that, but that the power requirements would create a detectable energy signature that would paint their location to any sufficiently sensitive monitoring system within range. He said he would accept that risk. She told him the risk was not his to accept alone, because the location in question contained multiple people and equipment that represented months of irreplaceable work. He looked at her with the flat, evaluating expression he wore when someone pushed back in a way he had not budgeted for in his internal model of how conversations were supposed to go. She looked back with the expression she had refined across years of negotiating with men who mistook certainty for authority. The standoff lasted approximately 8 seconds. Then Butcher moved on, which was, she had learned, his version of conceding the point. Huey brought her the Starlight question on day 14. Annie January, Starlight, was inside the 7, watching everything from the center of the machine. and she was the clearest example Bulma had encountered yet of what Compound 5 and Vought's system did to people who retained their conscience. A genuinely powerful, genuinely moral individual trapped inside an institution that was neither performing a character that had been designed by a marketing department while trying to protect people from the inside of the very system exploiting them. Bulma analyzed everything Huey told her about Annie's situation with the same methodical attention she gave to engineering problems, and arrived at a conclusion that she delivered without softening it. Annie's position inside the Seven was tactically valuable but personally unsustainable, and the longer she remained, the more the institution would use her integrity as its own credibility shield. She was not a spy inside an enemy base. She was being used as proof that the enemy base was worth defending. Huey did not like hearing that, but he did not argue with it either. Then came the moment that reordered everything. She had been running a passive deep scan on the Godmaker reference, threading signal queries through 17 layers of Vought's internal network using a penetration methodology so passive it generated less noise than ambient background radiation. When the system returned a partial document, not a full file. A fragment, 11 pages out of what had clearly been a much larger document, stripped of headers and index references but intact in content. She read it once quickly, then again slowly, and then she sat very still for a long time in a way that she almost never did because stillness was not her natural mode. What the document described was not another round of Compound 5 experiments. It was not a no, their enhancement program or another controlled hero deployment. Godmaker was a synthesis project. The attempt to create an individual whose Compound V variant was not merely powerful but self-replicating at the genetic level. A soup who could pass full enhancement to offspring without additional dosing, who could, in theory, seed an entirely new population of enhanced individuals outside Vought's production control. Biological independence from corporate infrastructure, a superhuman lineage that Vought could own at the source rather than maintaining through perpetual pharmaceutical dependency. They were not trying to make a better hero. They were trying to make a god they held the patent to. Bulma set the fragment down on the screen and stared at Godmaker at the center of her map. She thought about what that kind of technology would mean. Not in this room, not in this operation, but in the world. In every government that would pay for it. In every military program that would weaponize it. In every private actor who would acquire it outside regulatory reach and use it for something that made Vought look restrained. She thought about what her own knowledge of genetics and biochemistry, cross-referenced against this universe's existing research, could do with a project like this. And for the first time since she had arrived in this world, she felt something she did not like feeling. Not fear, not disgust, temptation. The cold, clean, purely intellectual temptation of a mind that had just been handed a problem complex enough to deserve its full attention. She recognized it immediately. The way you recognize a dangerous road by the drop on the other side. She closed the file. She added 3 more layers to the security protocol around her workstation, and she did not tell the boys what she had found. Not yet, because some information needed to be understood fully before it was shared, and she was not yet sure she understood it. What she was sure of was this. Vought was not just manufacturing heroes, it was manufacturing the future. And somewhere at the center of that project, smiling his practiced, hollow smile into a camera that had never once captured anything true about him, was a man whose growing interest in her location meant that future was running out of time. Homelander found her on a Thursday, not because Vought's security architecture had finally triangulated her location, not because an informant had surfaced her name. He found her the way apex predators find things in the wild, by following the disturbance pattern. Systems that had been running undisturbed for years had begun generating anomalies. Predictive models were returning noise where they had always returned clean data. A low-level, invisible pressure was moving through Vought's infrastructure like a current through water, sourceless, directionless, and impossible to stop because you cannot stop something you cannot locate. Homelander had asked his analysts where the disruption originated. They had given him probabilities and vectors and confidence intervals that ultimately amounted to a confession that they did not know. So he had done what he always did when institutional intelligence failed him. He had gone looking himself. He did not need a map. He needed to listen for the one frequency in a city full of noise that did not belong there. And when he found it, he descended from the sky with the unhurried certainty of something that had never learned to doubt its own arrival. Bulma heard the roof impact before she saw him. A single, clean detonation of weight and velocity that registered on her building's structural sensor array and sent a sharp alert across two of her screens simultaneously. She did not freeze. She ran a 3-second threat assessment, activated the electromagnetic masking protocol on her primary servers, closed the Godmaker files behind 4 layers of security, and turned to face the door with her scan, or already running his biometric profile before he had finished descending the external stairwell. The readings were extraordinary and immediately clarifying. Energy output, heat signature, structural density, flight capability confirmation, and underneath all of it, that synthetic baseline she now recognized immediately, the Compound 5 architecture running through him like rebar through concrete. She had a biochemical profile on him in 40 seconds. She had a partial psychological profile in 60, based purely on the way he moved through the space, deliberately slow, performing ease, performing ownership, performing the absolute calm of something that had spent so long being the most powerful entity in every room it had entered that it had forgotten rooms could contain things it did not already understand. He was exactly as tall as the billboards made him look. That was the first thing she noticed, that the mythology had not needed to exaggerate the physical reality, which told her something specific about how the mythology had been constructed. He wore the uniform with the ease of a second skin, and his face arranged itself into the smile she had seen on 40-foot screens across the city, wide, warm, and utterly uninhabited behind the eyes. He looked at her equipment with the polite curiosity of a man at a museum exhibit, and then he looked at her with something that was not curiosity at all. It was assessment. The particular cold measuring look of a predator deciding whether something in front of it represents food, threat, or irrelevance. Bulma looked back with none of the deference that look was designed to produce. She had looked at Vegeta at his worst. She had stood in the presence of Beerus, a literal god of destruction who erased stars when he was mildly irritated. She had a reasonably high threshold for intimidating presences. Homelander registered on Tuong. That threshold, but not where he was accustomed to landing. He asked her what she was building. She told him truthfully that she was conducting independent research. He asked, with the smile still precisely in place, whether she understood how many people had tried to conduct independent research in proximity to Vought's operational interests and had subsequently disappeared from every database that mattered. She told him she was aware of the statistical pattern. Yes. He tilted his head. A small, precise movement that she catalogued immediately as the gesture of someone who is not accustomed to receiving responses structured as data rather than fear. He told her she did not seem concerned. She told him she had assessed the variables and determined that she was more valuable to him alive and answering questions than dead, because whatever intelligence apparatus had directed him here had clearly failed to identify her origin, her methodology, or the scope of what she had already compiled, and she was the only person in the room who could fill those gaps voluntarily. He was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then he laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised both of them slightly. What followed was not a fight. It was something rarer and more dangerous than a fight. A conversation between two people who were both, in their own ways, performing something, while simultaneously trying to read the performance of the other for the reality beneath. Homelander moved through the space examining her equipment with the air of someone who was also conducting an assessment, asking questions that began as casual and became progressively more specific in ways that told her exactly what Vought wanted to know and exactly how much they had already guessed. She answered selectively, giving him enough truth to maintain the conversation's credibility while withholding everything that mattered structurally. She watched him the way she watched. Machines that might be malfunctioning, not with fear, but with the focused attention of someone who needed to understand the failure mode before deciding whether to repair it or get clear of the blast radius. She also watched the thing beneath the performance, because Homelander was many things: dangerous, unstable, capable of violence so casual it barely registered on his expression. But he was also at a level he worked very hard to keep submerged, profoundly and chronically alone. She recognized the specific behavioral architecture of someone who had been built rather than raised, who had been shaped by controlled conditions rather than genuine relationships, and who had arrived at adulthood with extraordinary power and no coherent internal structure to carry it in. The Compound V data had told her this scientifically. Watching him in the room confirmed it clinically. He did not want her dead because she was a threat to his power. He was considering killing her because she was looking at him without the expression he needed people to have. He needed the fear. He needed the worship. He needed the mirror of other people's terror to confirm that the image he maintained of himself was real. And Bulma was giving him none of that. She was giving him data. And data, for a man whose entire identity was built on myth, was somehow the most destabilizing thing she could have offered. He told her as he was leaving, and she noticed that he was leaving, that she had held the room long enough that leaving had become his choice rather than an escalation into violence. That she was interesting. He said it the way someone says it when they mean, "I have not decided what to do with you yet, and that uncertainty is your only protection." She told him that was a reasonable preliminary assessment. He looked at her one more time from the doorway, not with the billboard smile, but with something rawer and less constructed, something that in another life and another universe might have been the expression of a person rather than a product. Then he was gone, straight up through the roof like a missile traveling in reverse, the impact of his departure shaking dust from the ceiling beams. Bulma stood in the settling quiet and ran a full sweep for any surveillance devices he might have left. She found 2. She left them active but fed them a looped environmental recording, which was the technical equivalent of leaving the lights on while you climbed out the back window. She called the boys immediately. Not because she was shaken, she was not, or at least not in the way that showed, but because the visit had changed the timeline on everything. Vought now knew she existed as a specific, located individual rather than an abstract pattern of anomalies. The window for quiet, methodical preparation had just collapsed to something considerably narrower. Butcher listened to her account and said nothing for a long moment after she finished. Then he asked whether she had been afraid. She told him fear was not the relevant variable. What was relevant was that Homelander had come alone, without a security team, without official Vought authorization for the visit, which meant he had done it on his own initiative, which meant he was as interested in keeping her existence quiet from Vought's internal structure as he was in understanding what she was doing. He had his own reasons for wanting to know about her, his own parallel agenda that did not entirely align with his corporate handlers, and that, she told Butcher, was the most dangerous and the most useful thing she had learned today. Because a Homelander operating outside Vought's chain of command was a variable that even the KUA, machine that built him, could not fully predict, and unpredictable variables in the right hands could be redirected. The question was whether her hands were the right ones, and whether she could move quickly enough before he decided that curiosity had a shorter shelf life than annihilation. There is a specific threshold in scientific discovery that most researchers never approach closely enough to understand its true shape. It is not the moment when you find something new. It is the moment when you realize that what you have found cannot be unfound, that the knowledge now exists in your mind with the permanence of physical matter, and that every decision you make from this point forward will be made in its shadow. Bulma had crossed that threshold once before, when she had fully understood the mechanics of the time machine she built after Cell's first arrival, when she had sat with the complete implications of what she had created and realized that the technology was simultaneously the most important thing she had ever made and potentially the most destructive. She had crossed it again now. The Godmaker fragment had been sitting in her secured files for 72 hours. She had read it 11 times. She had run synthesis models, genetic projection analyses, and longitudinal population impact assessments. And she understood it now with the complete, crystalline clarity that she reserved for problems she had fully solved. She understood it well enough to finish it. That was the threshold. That was the shadow she was now working inside of. She told the boys about Godmaker on the 16th day, not because she had finished processing it. She was not sure she ever would. but because withholding it further crossed a line she had drawn for herself around operational honesty, and Bulma Brief did not cross her own lines without conscious decision. She presented it the way she presented everything, as data, structured and precise, with the implications laid out sequentially so that the weight of each revelation landed in the correct order. She watched their faces move through the same progression hers had. Frenchie reached the self-replicating genetics section and went very still in a way she had not seen from him before, which told her something significant about what it meant coming from a man who was rarely still. Reached the population projection section and stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there for a long time without saying anything. Huey asked, with a quiet that was more frightening than shouting, whether Vought was close to completing it. She told him they had been running the project for 11 years and were, based on the fragments she had recovered, somewhere in the final experimental phase. Butcher said nothing at all. He just looked at the center of her network diagram, at the word Godmaker circled 3 times in red, and his expression was the particular kind of empty that men wear when they are calculating something they already know they are not going to like the answer to. The conversation that followed was the hardest one she had experienced since arriving in this universe, and it was hard specifically because everyone in it was right in ways that were mutually incompatible. Butcher wanted to locate the primary Godmaker facility, breach it and destroy it completely. Equipment, research, personnel files, everything. Scorched earth. Agreed with the destruction objective but was insistent that any operation involving a black site of that scale required intelligence they did not yet have, and that moving prematurely would cost lives that the operation could not afford to cost. Huey argued that destruction alone was insufficient, that the public needed to know Godmaker had existed, because without that knowledge, Vought could simply restart the project under a different designation in a different facility, and the cycle would continue indefinitely. Frenchie raised the possibility that was sitting unspoken in the room like a third party, that Bulma, with her knowledge of the fragment and her own biochemical and genetic expertise, could potentially complete what Vought had started. Not for Vought, not for any corporation or government, but complete it, understand it fully, and then determine whether it should exist at all. They all looked at her when he said it. She looked back and did not deny the possibility because she did not deal in comfortable denials when the truth was sitting in the room with everyone. She had already run the model. She had run it the night after reading the fragment for the 3rd time, in the particular small hours when the honest parts of her mind operated without the social filtering that daylight required. She had taken the Godmaker architecture, cross-referenced it against her own understanding of genetic engineering, added the analytical framework she had developed working with Saiyan biology and the biochemical profiles she had built on every soup she had scanned since arriving, and run a completion simulation. It had taken 4 hours. The result had been technically elegant in a way that made her feel briefly, coldly proud, and then immediately made her feel something considerably worse than pride, because the completed version was not a weapon. It was not a corporate asset or a military program or a government project. It was a fundamental alteration of human biological potential, the kind of change that, once introduced into a population, could not be recalled, could not be contained, and could not be governed by any existing institutional structure. It was the end of one kind of world, and the beginning of another kind, and whether that other kind was better depended entirely on what kind of people were holding the first application of the technology when it was released. In this universe, at this moment, she already knew exactly what kind of people those would be. She did not tell the boys the simulation had succeeded. She told them she needed more time to assess the Godmaker fragment before any decisions were made about its handling, which was true in every way that mattered, and incomplete in one way that she was not yet ready to address. Instead, she redirected the operational focus to the most immediately actionable component of everything she had compiled, the staged incident documentation. 17 incidents, fully cross-referenced, with forensic evidence that was irrefutable by any journalistic standard and most legal ones. Hero response preceding emergency calls, deliberate structural damage attributed to villain activity that showed precise engineering signatures inconsistent with uncontrolled violence. Civilian deaths categorized as unavoidable collateral that her analysis showed were predictable consequences of staging choices made in pre-incident planning documents she had recovered from Vought's internal archive. She assembled it into a package, compressed, layered, and formatted for maximum comprehensibility across multiple media platforms, and began planning its distribution with the methodical attention she gave to technical deployments. This was the public exposure track. This was the thread that, when pulled, would begin unraveling the narrative architecture that held Vought's power together. She was not naive about what would follow the unraveling. She had thought about that carefully, because this was the thing about the boys' universe that made it categorically different from every other dangerous world she had encountered. It did not run on power. It ran on belief. Frieza's empire ran on power. Remove the power, remove the empire. Cell ran on power. Remove the power, remove the threat. Even the gods of her universe, for all their cosmic scale, operated through direct application of force. But Vought ran on something that power could not simply overwrite. It ran on the stories people told themselves about heroes, about safety, about the necessity of surrendering their own agency to entities that were stronger than them. And stories, unlike power structures, do not collapse when you destroy the thing at the center. Stories collapse only when enough people stop believing them simultaneously, and engineering that kind of simultaneous disbelief in a population that had been marinated in the opposite narrative for decades required more than evidence. It required a delivery system for the evidence that was as emotionally compelling as the original lie. Bulma was a scientist. She was an engineer. She was not, by training or instinct, a propagandist. But she was beginning to understand that in this universe, those disciplines were not as separate as she had previously assumed. Frenchie came to her workspace on the 18th night, alone, after the others had gone. He sat across from her equipment in the way he sometimes did, not asking for anything specific, just present in the comfortable way of someone who thought well in company. He told her, without preamble, that he had seen what happened to clever people in this universe. Not supes, clever people. People who understood the machine well enough to threaten it. He told her what happened to them was not what happened in movies or in adventure stories. There was no dramatic confrontation, no climactic moment of recognition. They simply stopped being findable. Their names stopped appearing in records. Their work was absorbed or erased. Their absence was administered quietly and efficiently by people who had decided that the cost of their continued existence had exceeded some internal threshold that no one had ever agreed to or consented to. He was not telling her to stop. She understood that clearly. He was telling her to be faster than the mechanism. She told him she was working on it. He nodded and poured 2 cups of coffee from a machine she had built specifically to produce something worth drinking in a universe that had apparently decided mediocre coffee was acceptable. And they sat in the humming server noise silence of the workspace and drank it. And neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the timeline had already compressed past the comfortable margin. That Homelander's visit had moved something in Vought's internal calculus that was now moving toward them with the quiet, accelerating certainty of something that had made a decision and was implementing it. That the window between exposure and elimination was narrowing to the width of a single correct choice. And that somewhere in the files she had not yet fully shared with anyone, there was a completed Godmaker model that could change everything, for better or for worse. And that the difference between those 2 outcomes was a question she had not yet fully answered, even for herself. On the 19th day, Bulma made the decision that changed everything. Not the decision about Godmaker. She was still carrying that one in the locked part of her mind, where the hardest problems lived until they were ready to be solved or surrendered. The decision she made on the 19th day was simpler and more immediately irreversible. She released the first package. Not the full staged incident documentation. Not the Godmaker fragments. A surgical first strike. 3 incidents, fully evidenced, formatted across 17 simultaneous distribution channels using anonymous routing architecture that would take Vought's technical team a minimum of 6 days to trace back to a source that would itself be a dead end pointing nowhere. The 3 incidents she chose were not the most dramatic. They were the most undeniable, clean forensic chains, time-stamped pre-positioning data, corporate communications cross-referenced against public emergency records. She had selected them with the same criteria she used when choosing which variable to isolate in a complex experiment, the ones whose results would be impossible to misread, regardless of how the surrounding noise was managed. She uploaded the package at 3:47 in the morning and then sat back and watched the first tremors move through Vought's public monitoring systems like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples began immediately. By dawn, they were waves. The media response was not what she had modeled, or rather, it was exactly what her most pessimistic model had projected, and she had hoped would not prove accurate. The evidence was irrefutable. The documentation was airtight. The forensic analysis was constructed to a standard that would have passed peer review in any legitimate scientific institution, and the dominant response from the largest news organizations was not investigation, it was management. She watched network anchors frame the release as potentially fabricated, possibly foreign in origin, and certainly suspicious in timing. She watched Vought's communications team deploy a counter-narrative in under 4 hours that was technically impossible without preparation, which meant they had been running contingency scenarios for exactly this kind of exposure event and had response architecture ready to activate. She watched the cycle run. Evidence surfaces, counter-narrative deploys, confusion fills the space between them, and the confusion is more useful to power than either truth or silence, because confused people do not act. They wait for someone to tell them what to think. And in this universe, the entity best positioned to tell people what to think was the same as the entity that had created the problem in the first place. Huey took it the hardest, not because he was surprised. He had lived inside this world's specific cruelty long enough to understand its rhythms, but because he had believed, with the particular stubbornness of someone who needed to believe it to keep functioning, that sufficient truth delivered sufficiently clearly would eventually break through the machinery of denial. Bulma did not tell him he was wrong to have believed that. She understood the psychological necessity of that kind of hope in people who were operating inside systems designed to exhaust them. She told him instead what she had recalibrated after watching the counter-narrative deploy. A single evidence package, however well constructed, could be managed. The architecture of denial was built to process individual truths and render them inert. What it could not process was simultaneous, distributed, irreducible volume. A release not of 3 incidents but of all 17, delivered not through 17 channels but through hundreds, formatted not just for journalists, but for the direct consumption of every ordinary person who had ever stood on a street corner and watched a hero incident and felt, in some inarticulate way, that something about it was wrong. She needed to make the denial machine work harder than its designers had budgeted for. She needed to flood the system. She was 3 days from being ready to do exactly that when Vought found the workspace. Not through the technical surveillance channels she had been monitoring and defeating continuously. Through something older and more difficult to counter, a human informant. Someone inside the boy's extended network whose loyalty had been purchased at a price she would never know, who had passed a location reference to a Vought intermediary in exchange for something that mattered more to them than the mission. She did not blame them. She understood what this universe did to ordinary people's capacity for sustained resistance against an institution that controlled their economic survival, their physical safety, and the narrative that explained their lives to them. She had 3 minutes of warning from her perimeter sensors before the response team arrived. She used 2 of them to transfer every critical file to an encrypted remote cache. She used the third to destroy the physical workstation in a way that left nothing recoverable. She walked out of the building with a single bag containing her emergency toolkit, her scanner, and the one device she had not yet shown anyone. She did not look back at the burning equipment. She had built it once. She could build it again. What could not be rebuilt was the time she had spent inside it, and Vought had just taken that from her, which was the precise kind of theft that moved something in her from cold analytical focus into something considerably warmer and less patient. The boys regrouped in a location had held in reserve for exactly this contingency, a space so thoroughly ordinary that it functioned as camouflage by virtue of its complete unremarkability. Butcher assessed the situation with his characteristic economy of expression and told her that the loss of the workspace was a significant setback. She told him it was a compression of the timeline, not a termination of it, which was a distinction he appeared to find insufficiently comforting. She laid out the revised operational plan across the next 40 minutes, and it was significantly more aggressive than anything she had previously proposed, not because she had abandoned her preference for precision over speed, but because precision and speed had ceased to be alternatives. They were now both mandatory. The full documentation release needed to happen within 72 hours. The Godmaker facility needed it to be located and addressed within the same window. And both operations needed to run simultaneously, because sequential execution now gave Vought enough time between them to implement containment measures that would render the second operation impossible. Frenchie asked whether she had enough of the biochemical inhibitor units ready for field deployment. She had 4 fully operational and components for 3 more that could be assembled in 6 hours. Mapped the distribution across likely conflict scenarios with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to treat impossible situations as logistics problems because the alternative was paralysis. Huey coordinated with Starlight through the careful, indirect communication protocol they had developed for exactly the kind of moment when their connection became both most necessary and most dangerous for her. Kimiko sat across the room from Bulma in the particular silence she maintained in operational moments, watching everything with an attention that missed nothing, and at one point caught Bulma's eye and held it for a moment in a look that did not need translation. She knew what Bulma was carrying that she had not yet shared. She did not push, but she knew. Bulma looked back and said nothing. Some weights needed to be carried alone until the moment they had to be set down. Then Butcher asked the question she had been expecting for days. He asked, with the flat directness that was his only mode of genuine communication, what was in the secured file that she had not yet shared with anyone. She looked at him for a moment. Then she told him about the completed Godmaker synthesis model, not the fragment, but the full solved version that existed only in her encrypted cache and in her own memory. She told him what it was, what it could do, and what the decision space around it looked like from where she was standing. The room was very quiet when she finished. Buttsy, her said, "So you can build God." She told him that was a reductive framing but not technically inaccurate. He asked what she was going to do with it, and she told him, with the complete, undecorated honesty she reserved for moments when anything less would be a form of cowardice, that she did not know yet, but that she had 72 hours to decide, and that the decision would need to be the right one, not just for the operation, not just for the people in this room, but for every person in a world that had been systematically lied to about the nature of power and had never once been asked what kind of world they actually wanted to live in. Homelander's heat signature appeared on her scanner 3 seconds later, moving toward their location at speed. Whatever she was going to decide, she was going to have to decide it faster than she had planned. She had 4 minutes. The scanner was tracking Homelander's heat signature moving through the city at the particular velocity that meant he was not trying to be subtle, not the slow, performative descent of a hero arriving for cameras, but the straight, purposeful trajectory of something that had stopped performing entirely and was moving toward a specific coordinate with the focused efficiency of a missile that had already selected its target. Bulma read the speed, calculated the intercept window, and said 4 minutes in a voice that landed in the room like a starting gun. What followed was not panic. The boys did not panic. They had been operating inside crisis windows so consistently that urgency had become their default operational state rather than an emergency deviation from it. They moved with the practiced compression of people who had learned that 4 minutes, handled correctly, was enough time to change the shape of a situation completely. Bulma moved with something different, the absolute tunnel vision focus of a scientist who had just had her most important variable walk into her experimental window ahead of schedule. She activated the remote documentation release in the first 60 seconds. Not the partial package. All of it. Every staged incident, every compound Vi paper trail, every falsified hero rescue, every civilian death buried under positive press coverage, simultaneously deployed across 437 distribution channels using the routing architecture she had built and rebuilt across 3 different workspace iterations. The upload confirmation came back in 40 seconds. She watched it cascade through the network with the particular feeling of a person who has released something that cannot be recalled, and recognized that feeling for what it was, not relief and not fear, but the specific, irreversible weight of a choice that has crossed from the space of decisions into the space of consequences. Whatever happened in the next 4 minutes, the documentation was out. Vought's counter-narrative machine was going to hit a volume it had never been designed to process. The denial architecture was going to work harder than its designers had intended. That was done. She turned back to the room. Butcher had the inhibitor units deployed across 4 positions in the space. Not optimal placement for a confirmed single target, but correctly configured for a scenario where Homelander might not be the only supe arriving within the engagement window, which was a possibility Bulma had already flagged on her scanner. 2 additional heat signatures had appeared in the outer tracking radius, moving on intercept courses from different vectors. Not the 7. The biochemical profiles read differently, lower grade, more variable, which meant Vought had deployed enhanced field assets rather on their primary roster. Probably a calculation that primary assets were more valuable as public-facing properties than as black operation enforcement, which was the kind of institutional thinking that was simultaneously cynical and tactically transparent. had already read the same implication from the positioning and was coordinating with Frenchie on the secondary threat vectors without needing to be told. Kimiko was at the room's most defensible structural point, which she had identified and moved to without instruction the moment the scanner alert sounded. Huey was on communication with Starlight, relaying the situation in the compressed, pre-agreed shorthand they had developed for exactly this kind of moment. Homelander came through the roof, not the door. The roof, through concrete and steel reinforcement, in a single descending impact that shook the building's structural frame and brought dust cascading from every surface simultaneously. He landed in the center of the room with the theatrical timing of someone who had done this entrance enough times to know exactly what it produced in the people below him. The cognitive freeze that comes when something physically impossible happens directly in front of you. The half-second of neural overload that separates the person's response time from their intention time. For the people he usually visited this way, that half-second was the entire ballgame. But Bulma had been tracking his approach for 4 minutes and had spent 3 of them preparing for exactly this entry point, and the inhibitor field emitter positioned in the ceiling's northwest structural corner had already activated before the dust from his landing had finished falling. She watched his expression change, a small, almost imperceptible shift in the set of his jaw, the slight recalibration of his posture, as the field's effect moved through him. Not dramatic. Not incapacitating, but measurable. She was watching his power output on her scanner, and she watched it drop, not to 0, to something considerably less than absolute, 4 to 7 minutes. She had his full attention before he had fully processed what had just changed about the room. What she had not planned for, or rather, what she had planned for as a low-probability contingency and had hoped would not materialize, was the version of Homelander that arrived when the performance finally stopped. In every previous interaction, she had read him as a system running a continuous output. The smile, the posture, the voice calibrated precisely to dominate social space without triggering the specific kind of resistance that open aggression would produce. That was the managed version, the product version. The version Vought had spent decades teaching him to present to a world that needed to believe it was being protected rather than owned. What came through the roof was something different. The smile was gone. What replaced it was not rage. Rage would have been manageable, predictable, something with a shape she could work with tactically. What replaced it was something rawer and more unstable than rage. The expression of a person who has spent their entire existence being the most powerful thing in every room and has just encountered a room where that is measurably, demonstrably, instrument confirmably no longer entirely true and does not have the psychological architecture to process that information without structural damage to the identity built on top of it. He looked at her specifically, not at Butcher, who was the largest physical presence in the room and the most conventionally threatening. Not at Kimiko, who was visibly the most kinetically dangerous. At her. She understood why immediately, and the understanding was not comfortable. She was the source of the FILD. She was the architect of everything that had happened to his world in the last 3 weeks. She was the variable that had entered his operational environment and had refused to behave the way variables in his environment were supposed to behave, which was to say, with appropriate terror, appropriate deference, and appropriate willingness to be managed or eliminated. She had studied him instead of fearing him. She had measured him instead of worshiping him. She had, in the most precise technical sense possible, treated him as a problem to be solved rather than a power to be submitted to. And for a man whose entire psychological architecture was built on the foundation of being unsolvable and unsurvivable, that was not merely an insult. It was an existential threat to the only version of himself he knew how to be. He told her, not shouted, which was worse somehow, told her in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled in the specific way of something that was neither quiet nor controlled underneath, that she had made a significant error in judgment by releasing the documentation. She told him, with the complete steadiness she had maintained through every previous interaction, that she disagreed with that assessment and that she was happy to walk him through the analytical basis for the decision if he had time. He stared at her. She watched his power output on her scanner and watched it continuing to suppress under the field effect, fluctuating at the edges as his physiology worked against the inhibitor, and she could see from the fluctuation curve that the window was closer to 4 minutes than 7. She needed the next 4 minutes to run in a specific direction, and running them in that direction required keeping him in conversation rather than in action, which required something she was going to have to do carefully because it was either the most tactically precise thing she had done since arriving in this universe, or a catastrophic miscalculation with a blast radius that included everyone in the building. She told him about Godmaker. Not everything. She had never told anyone everything, and she was not going to start now in a situation with this many active variables. She told him enough, that she knew what Vought was building, that she knew what it meant for every soup currently operating inside Vaught's framework, and specifically what it meant for him, because Godmaker, fully realized, was the end of Homelander's singular position. A self-replicating enhancement lineage did not need a flagship product. It did not need a symbol, a face, a 40-foot billboard icon whose approval ratings had to be managed and maintained. It needed a foundation genetic instance, and then it needed to propagate, and once it propagated, the individual at the top of the current hierarchy became as disposable as last season's brand campaign. Vought was not building a better hero. They were building his replacement, his obsolescence, the product line that would make the original prototype unnecessary. She watched his face while she told him this, and she watched something move through him that was more complex and more human than anything she had seen from him previously. Something that had no comfortable name but lived in the space between betrayal and the sudden sickening recognition that the betrayal had always been there, hiding in plain sight behind the sponsorship deals and the adoration and the carefully managed mythology of the most powerful man alive. She had 4 minutes each. She had his complete, total, devastatingly personal attention. And outside, in 437 distribution channels, the truth about his world was already moving faster than anything Vought had built to stop it. The inhibitor field held for 5 minutes and 40 seconds. She knew because she was watching the scanner read out continuously, tracking the fluctuation curve as Homelander's physiology fought the biochemical disruption with the sustained, grinding persistence of an organism that had been engineered specifically to resist exactly this kind of interference. She had built the field for 4 to 7 minutes. It gave her 540, which was enough. Not comfortably enough. Not with the margin she would have preferred. But enough for the conversation to run its necessary length, for the secondary Vought assets outside to be handled by the boys through methods she deliberately did not observe in detail, and for something to happen in the room between her and Homelander that she had not fully predicted and that she would spend a long time afterward trying to accurately categorize. It was not an alliance. It was not a surrender on his part. It was something more unstable and more interesting than either. The specific, volatile shift in a person's orientation when a truth they have been avoiding finds the one angle they cannot deflect it from. Homelander had spent his entire existence being the apex of a system. She had shown him the system's blueprint, and his name was not at the top of it. It was in the expendable column, and that knowledge was now inside him, where it would do its work regardless of what he did next. When the field dropped, he left. Not in violence. Not in the dramatic heat vision and destruction mode she had been prepared for. He left in the particular heavy silence of someone who has received information that has broken something internal and is now carrying the wreckage back to a private place to assess the damage. She watched his heat signature ascend from the building and tracked it until it exceeded her scanner's effective range, and then she stood in the dusty, concrete-scarred room with the others and ran the full threat sweep one more time before allowing herself to exhale completely. The secondary Vought assets had been neutralized. She gathered from the brief, undecorated report Butcher gave that Neutralized covered a range of outcomes she did not need the specific details of. The building was clear. The documentation release was confirmed active across all 437 channels and had already been picked up by 17 independent media organizations outside Vought's direct ownership reach. The situation had moved, not resolved, moved, into a new phase with a new shape, and the new shape was considerably more complex and considerably less controllable than the previous one. Butcher asked her about Godmaker again. This time, he did not ask what she was going to do with it. He asked whether she had already decided. She told him yes. He asked what the decision was. She told him she needed 1 hour and access to specific materials, and that after that hour, she would show him rather than tell him, because the decision was not the kind of thing that translated cleanly into a verbal summary without losing the architecture that made it the right decision rather than merely a decision. He looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating expression she had learned to read as his version of respect. Not warmth, not trust exactly, but the particular acknowledgement of a man who had learned to recognize capability even when it made him uncomfortable. He told her she had 1 hour. She used 53 minutes of it. The other 7 she spent sitting quietly, which was the closest thing to prayer she had ever practiced. Not directed at anything, not requesting anything, just the deliberate act of sitting with the full weight of a choice before implementing it so that it was made with complete awareness rather than the comfortable momentum of forward motion that made hard choices feel easier than they were. The God-Maker synthesis model was the most complete piece of scientific work she had ever produced in terms of raw technical elegance. She had known that when she finished it. She had known it the way you know when something is genuinely, structurally perfect. Not just functional, not just impressive, but built to the exact level of precision that closes every theoretical gap and leaves nothing unresolved in the underlying architecture. She had felt briefly, genuinely proud of it, and that pride had been followed immediately by the recognition that she was proud of something that could end the world as currently constituted, which was a complicated emotional state that she had no immediate framework for resolving. In her universe, she had made things that changed the world before. The Dragon radar had changed the world. The time machine had changed the world. The distinction she had decided across 53 minutes of working and 7 minutes of sitting was this. Those inventions had changed the world by giving people tools. Godmaker would change the world by rewriting people themselves. The difference between a tool and a fundamental alteration of human biology was the difference between giving someone a better road and replacing the human foot. One expanded possibility. The other eliminated the version of humanity that existed before it was applied, and she had no right. And neither did Vought, neither did any government, neither did any single intelligence, however capable, to make that choice for 8 billion people who had never been asked. She deleted the synthesis model from every system on which it existed. The remote encrypted cache, the local backup she had maintained as redundancy, the partial derivation notes she had kept separately as a methodological record. She deleted them with the complete, irreversible thoroughness she applied to every process she committed to, overriding each file with cascading null data patterns that rendered recovery impossible by any technical methodology currently available in this universe. The God-Maker model was gone, not destroyed in the sense of an explosion, not spectacular in any way, but gone with the finality of something that has been genuinely and permanently removed from the world rather than merely relocated within it. She sat back from the terminal. The room was quiet. She was aware of a specific, complex feeling. Not satisfaction, not grief exactly, but something that occupied the space between them. The feeling of having given something up that you were capable of and deciding that capability was not sufficient justification for use. She had known that principle her entire life. She had never applied it to something this significant before. She brought the God-Maker fragment itself, the original 11 pages she had recovered, to the boys and told them what she had done and why. Butcher listened without expression. MM nodded once, slowly, with the gravity of someone who had long ago made his own peace with the relationship between capability and restraint. Frenchie was quiet in the particular way that meant he was processing something that genuinely moved him. Huey looked, at her with the expression she had come to associate with his particular brand of stubborn, battered idealism, the look of someone who keeps finding reasons to believe in people despite comprehensive evidence that the universe does not reward that belief, and who finds each new reason both exhausting and necessary. Kimiko held her gaze for a long moment and then nodded. The smallest, most complete acknowledgement Bulma had received from anyone since arriving in this world. She told them the fragment itself needed to be distributed alongside the documentation release, not published broadly, not given to the public in a form that could be used as an instruction manual by the next institution that decided to play God with human biology, but given to the right people, independent scientists, bioethics organizations operating outside Vought's funding reach, international bodies with both the standing and the motivation to ensure this particular direction of research was placed under regulatory architecture before someone else found the same road Vought had been walking. Then Huey's phone generated the alert they had all been waiting for and dreading simultaneously. The documentation release had broken containment on Vought's narrative management systems. The volume had done exactly what she had calculated it would. The denial architecture was processing 17 times its designed capacity and was generating inconsistencies that were themselves becoming news. Journalists who had initially framed the release as potentially fabricated were being contradicted by colleagues who had independently verified specific documents. The staged incident evidence was being cross-referenced by citizen investigators in real time across platforms that Vought's communications team could not simultaneously manage. The counter-narrative was fragmenting under the weight of its own internal contradictions. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a signal that Starlight had been preparing for weeks. Annie January's own account, in her own voice from inside the Seven, had just gone live on every platform simultaneously. The mask was not coming off cleanly. Masks never did. But it was coming off, in pieces, in public, in a way that the machine had not been built to survive intact. The world outside was starting to understand something it had been carefully, expensively, systematically prevented from understanding for decades. And the understanding was not arriving neatly or gently or in a form that could be easily integrated. It was arriving the way structural truths always arrive when they have been suppressed long enough, all at once, with the force of something that has been compressed beyond its containment limit, producing not clarity but chaos, not liberation but the terrifying, necessary, irreversible dissolution of the story that had been holding everything in its false and fragile place. Bulma stood at the window of the unremarkable building in the unremarkable part of the city and watched the news cycle detonate across every screen visible from her position. She watched Vought's stock price collapse in real time on a financial feed running in the corner of her scanner display. She watched the public space outside fill with people whose expressions carried the specific confusion of those who have just discovered that a fundamental premise of their understanding of safety was a manufactured fiction. She watched a child on the street below look up at a Homelander billboard with the particular stillness of someone who is processing a revision to something they had believed without question. And she felt the weight of what she had done and what she had not done sitting toga, there in her chest, the release and the deletion and the choice. And she understood that neither the feeling of rightness nor the feeling of cost was going to resolve cleanly into the other. Both were true simultaneously. Both would remain true. That was the specific texture of this kind of decision, and she had known that before she made it, and had made it anyway, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever done. Outside, the city was beginning, messily and painfully, and without any guarantee of what came next, to wake up. And somewhere above it all, moving through the sky in a trajectory her scanner could no longer track, a man in red, white, and blue was carrying the knowledge she had given him through the cold air toward a destination that neither she nor anyone else in the building could predict. That uncertainty was the last variable she could not control, and Bulma Brief, who had built her entire life around controlling variables, sat with it and let it be unresolved. 3 weeks after the release, Vought International was still standing. That was the first thing Bulma had to reckon with, not as a failure of planning or execution, but as a fundamental truth about how systems built on belief actually die. They do not collapse the way structures collapse all at once, in a single catastrophic event that leaves clean rubble and a clear before and after line. They fragment. They shed components while the core continues operating behind new branding, new spokespeople, new narrative architecture assembled from the wreckage of the old one with the practiced efficiency of an institution that has survived exposure before and has contingency plans for surviving it again. Vought's legal division had filed injunctions against 41 of the 437 distribution channels within 72 hours of the release. Their communications team had pivoted from denial to controlled acknowledgement, admitting peripheral failures while vigorously defending the core enterprise, which was the corporate equivalent of conceding the flood while insisting the foundations were sound. 3 board members had resigned publicly. 2 had not resigned but had quietly transferred significant asset holdings into structures 2 degrees of separation removed from the parent company. The machine was wounded. It was not dead. Bulma had known it would not be dead. She had built her expectations accordingly, which was the only way to work inside a system this deeply entrenched without being destroyed by the gap between what you hoped for and what the world was capable of delivering. Homelander had not been seen publicly in 11 days. His absence from the media cycle had generated more coverage than his presence would have. The specific, anxious fascination of a public whose primary symbol of safety had gone silent at the exact moment the safety narrative was being dismantled around it. Vought's communications team had issued statements describing a scheduled operational recalibration period, which was the institutional language for "we do not know where he is, and we are not going to say that publicly." Her scanner had tracked his heat signature twice in the days following their last meeting, once moving out of the city entirely, once returning in the early hours of a morning when the surveillance architecture was at its lowest density. She did not follow the signature. She had told him something true and had deleted the synthesis model and had left the rest of it in the space between his capability and his choice, which was the only honest place she could leave it. Whether that space produced something better or something catastrophically worse was a question this universe would answer on its own timeline, without her control and without her permission. That was the specific, unresolvable discomfort of having done the right thing in a world not designed to reward it. The boys were reconfiguring. The exposure had changed their operational environment in ways that were simultaneously better and more dangerous than the previous state. More public attention meant more protection from quiet elimination, but it also meant Vought's remaining assets were operating with the particular desperation of an institution that has decided survival requires removing the people who threatened it before the legal architecture fully closes around it. Butcher was running 3 simultaneous operations with the focused intensity of a man who had spent years fighting for a result and was now fighting even harder inside the result because the result had turned out to be a different kind of battle rather than a conclusion. was coordinating civilian protection around the urban areas where the post-exposure chaos had created genuine safety vacuums, places where the collapse of the hero narrative had left communities without even the fiction of protection, which was its own specific cruelty. Frenchie and Kimiko were handling things she did not ask the details of, and they were handling them together, which was the most functional arrangement she had observed since arriving in this universe. Huey was talking to journalists, to lawyers, to international oversight organizations, to anyone who would listen and many who initially would not, carrying evidence packages she had formatted for exactly those conversations. He was not the most tactically sophisticated person she had encountered. He was the most persistently human one. In this universe, that distinction mattered more than she had initially weighted it. She had stayed longer than she intended. The dimensional anomaly that had deposited her in this world was technically replicable. She had rebuilt the necessary components twice over across her various workspace iterations, and a return transit was achievable within 48 hours of committed construction. She had not committed to constructing it. She had told herself this was because there were still operational loose ends that her presence was useful in resolving. That was partially true. The fuller truth, which she examined honestly in the particular quiet of late nights in the new workspace she had established in a location that had so far remained uncompromised, was that leaving felt like abandonment in a way she was not yet ready to simply decide past. She had come to this world by accident. She had changed things here by choice. The ethical weight of those changes, the documentation release, the Godmaker deletion, The Homelander conversation, all of it, did not disappear when she left. It remained here, in the consequences still unfolding, in the people still operating inside those consequences, in the world still deciding what to do with the truth she had helped force into the open. She was not responsible for this world, but she had touched it. And touching something, in her experience, created obligations that distance did not dissolve. Starlight had reached out to her directly on the 9th day after the release, through a channel Huey had established that was secure enough for the conversation they needed to have. Annie January was the most genuinely heroic person Bulma had encountered in this universe. Not because of her power, but because of what she had chosen to do with it at enormous personal cost inside a system specifically designed to convert individual moral courage into institutional credibility and use it to prop up the same machine, though courage was directed against. They spoke for 2 hours. Bulma gave her everything she had on the remaining Vought infrastructure she had mapped. Not just the exposure documentation, but the deeper architectural analysis, the black site projections, the supply chain irregularities that pointed toward programs still running below the current media waterline. Annie received it with the focused attention of someone who had learned to metabolize enormous amounts of terrible information without letting it paralyze the next action. Before they ended the conversation, Annie asked her one question. Why had she deleted the Godmaker model rather than using it to create something better? Bulma was quiet for a moment. Then she told her, because better, in the hands of any single person, is just a different kind of control. And this world already had too many people who had decided their version of better was worth imposing on everyone else. Annie was quiet on the other end of the line. Then she said, I know. I just needed to hear someone else say it. On the 28th day, Bulma completed construction of the transit device. She did not use it immediately. She spent one additional day doing what she had done on the first day, walking through the city, observing, letting the environment explain itself. It explained something different now than it had 3 weeks ago. Not better exactly, not safer, but different in the specific way of a place where a lie has been partially dismantled and the space the lie occupied has not yet been filled with anything else. A gap in the social architecture, uncomfortable and necessary simultaneously. The kind of open space that either becomes something new and more honest or gets filled again with the next available mythology by a population that finds uncertainty harder to live inside than a comforting fiction. She saw the Homelander billboard, Diaz being taken down on one street and left standing on another. She saw a newsstand running 2 contradictory front pages about the same Vought story. She saw a group of people arguing on a corner about whether the documented heroes were all corrupt, or only some of them, which was progress of a kind, because the argument itself meant the question was now at least available in a way it had not been a month ago. She saw the child she had observed on her first day, or a child who looked like that child, standing in front of the empty space where a Homelander billboard had been removed, looking at the blank wall with an expression she could not fully read from her distance. She hoped it was the beginning of a question. She knew it might also be the beginning of a search for the next answer that felt safe enough to stop questioning. She activated the transit device in the workspace, alone, at 4 in the morning on the 29th day. She had left behind what she had decided it was ethical to leave behind, and destroyed what she had decided it was dangerous to leave. The defensive scanner units, recalibrated and production documented, so they could be replicated by anyone with intermediate electronics knowledge and publicly available components. The compound Vive analysis in full, formatted for independent scientific distribution and legal application. A comprehensive operational map of Vought's remaining hidden infrastructure, formatted for investigative use by the organizations Huey had been building relationships with. She had left nothing that could be used to create a new arms race, nothing that solved the problem of power by concentrating it somewhere else, nothing that offered easy answers to questions this world needed to learn to answer for itself. What she had left was information, clarity, and the particular gift of having made certain truths impossible to unthink. That was not nothing. In a world built on managed lies, IT was perhaps the most disruptive thing she had ever contributed to anywhere. The dimensional tear opened with the familiar crackling geometry of transit technology, and Bulma Brief stepped through it carrying the same emergency toolkit she had arrived with, one new scanner calibrated to frequencies she had not known existed before this world had taught her they did, and something she had not arrived with and could not put in a bag: the specific permanent knowledge of what a civilization looks like when it perfects the architecture of beautiful, profitable, cheering lies. She carried that knowledge back through the tear and back into her own universe, where the problems were louder and the enemies were more honest about being enemies, and where she would sit in her laboratory above Capsule Corporation and think, sometimes, in the quiet hours, about a city that had watched its monsters smile from 40-foot billboards and called it safety, about a world that had been given the truth and had to decide whether it wanted it, about a child standing in front of a blank wall where a false god used to be, looking at the empty space with an expression that might have been the first moment of a better question, or might have been the beginning of the search for the next comfortable answer, and how she could not know which, and how that uncertainty was not a failure of the work she had done but the truest possible measure of it, because she had not come to save this world, and she had not saved it, and salvation was never what it had needed. What it had needed was exactly what she had given it: the irreversible, uncomfortable, necessary destruction of the story it had been telling itself about who the monsters were, where they lived, and what their faces looked like when they smiled. She had not arrived in a world of heroes. She had arrived in a marketplace of monsters, and the most terrifying thing, the thing that would stay with her longer than the scanner readings, longer than the network diagrams, longer than the memory of Homelander's face in the moment the mythology cracked, was how many people, even now, even after everything, still wanted to believe the masks were real. If this story made you think about what it means when truth is weaker than branding, drop your answer in the comments. Could Bulma actually destroy Vought faster than the boys ever could? And if she had kept the Godmaker model, would that have made her the most dangerous thing in the universe, or something worse? Subscribe for more grimdark crossovers. The next one goes somewhere even darker.